I'm really excited to be here. I spoke at the conference a couple of years ago, I believe the first COVID year for all of this, and did a similar presentation. I know many of you are facing some, shall we say, some interesting local lunatics who are trying to kind of make your lives a little bit harder when it comes to your advocacy work. We in the bicycle advocacy space end up having a lot of, for lack of a better way of putting it, natural enemies, but folks who are opposed to our points of view and willing to do a whole host of things to kind of get in the way of good public policy that we're trying to put forward. So my hope is today, and of course, we're also going to be meeting again in April. For those of you who are interested, we'll be talking about elections and election-related activity for 501c3s, giving you the basis to know how to make sure that you're on the right side of things, to make sure that you're presenting yourself in a way that is fully in compliance with the law to beat back some of these attempts. If you do have any questions on any of this, I'm going to have probably a few minutes of time at the end of all of this, but you can also get in touch with us, and I'll make sure that you've got a resource, email and phone number to call. It'll either be myself or one of my colleagues. Alliance for Justice and Boulder Advocacy is there for you if you've got questions on your advocacy related activities. So just want to make sure that you know that if you stick around, you'll get that resource as well. Quick little bit about my background. Of course, practice law in this area for Alliance for Justice, but some of you occasionally will sometimes recognize me from my bicycle advocacy. I have been working on the Pedal Shift project for the better part of the last 9 years. I do a lot of work around advocacy and education around bicycle travel, particularly bicycle touring. And that was my bike on the Katy Trail those many years ago. So if you recognize me from that, hello, I'm also a lawyer, as you probably know. Let's get started here. If you've got questions, make sure you get them into the Q&A box there, and I will do my best to answer them at the end of our session together. I will try to roll through this to make sure that we've got plenty of time to answer those questions as we go about it. If for some reason we can't get to all of your questions, again, you can get in touch with us later on. I want to focus in on this. This is our tried and true chart, which talks about the different types of tax-exempt organizations. We'll really focus in on the left-hand side column here today. My organization, the League of American Bicyclists, many of your organizations, including the Washington Area Bicyclists Association, that is my local one. Hello, if you're here. Your tax treatment, best under the law. Federal tax law says that you're tax exempt, and that means that you don't tend to pay taxes at any level of government, federal, state, or local, with some exceptions that I won't go into right here to get too into the weeds. The big ticket thing, though, for you as a public charity, though, is if someone makes a donation to your organization, you're able to confer tax deductibility to that donation. That is the best tax treatment under the law. The great part about that is it's the best tax treatment. The downside to it as advocates is we tend to get more limitations on our advocacy the better our tax treatment. Nowhere is that more obvious than in the two areas I'm going to talk about today, one in depth, one very, very minimally. Lobbying activities, we can do it. We can do actually a pretty permissive amount of it, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, but we are limited in how much that we can accomplish as 501c3 public charities. It's limited. We're going to talk all about that for the better part of the next hour or so. Electoral activities, we're really going to focus in on that more next time, next month. However, suffice to say, you probably already knew this, you can't do anything that even remotely looks like, smells like, etc., support for candidates or opposition to candidates for public office. Now, ballot measures, we can work on those types of things. Nonpartisan voter engagement, we can absolutely do that type of work out of 501c3s. So it doesn't mean that we can't be active during elections. We can be very active, and for many of our organizations, we should be very active around elections. The line, though, the very serious line, is supporting or opposing candidates. If you cross that line, you run the risk of losing your tax-exempt status by the IRS. This is the area that a lot of opponents will tend to look at, trying to make it look or feel like that your activities are supporting or opposing candidates to try to get the IRS to come after you. And we'll talk all about that in the next session if you're able to join us then. I'm not going to spend any more time on the other groups. I will just say the middle column, your 501c4 organizations, your labor unions, your trade associations, they all play by the same rules. 501c13s are qualified cemeteries. Never run into one of those. Would like to someday. Same basic rules. A 501c4 is a good ally to have on your side because their tax treatment isn't quite as good, but they're allowed to do more advocacy. So having them in our coalitions is very important and helpful because they can do more than we can, but we work in the overlap together on legislative and policy issues quite a bit. So the fact that their tax treatment isn't quite as good allows them to do more advocacy. They're good friends to have. That's all I'm going to kind of go with on that. 527 groups, we tend not to pal around with them too much. They're if you read Superman comics like I did back in the day, they're the bizarro Superman to our Superman. They are the flip opposite. They almost exclusively work around trying to get candidates elected or defeated, opposite of what we can do as 501c3s. So let's really focus in on that box around lobbying. And what we can do around lobbying activity. But before I get there, I want to make sure that everybody understands one really important thing. We hear the word advocacy thrown around a lot, the work that we do. Advocacy, it surprises a lot of folks, does not have a legal definition in kind of the area that I work and practice law in. I like to split it up into a variety of different things. We've already talked about two of them. Full-on restriction, can't do anything partisan political, supporting or opposing candidates. We're allowed to do things around lobbying activity just in a limited amount, but just about anything else that I would characterize as advocacy, well, we can do as much of it as we want. There's no legal limitations based on our tax status for this. So organizing, education, holding conferences or attending conferences, a training like this one, even litigation. I used to start off my career suing polluters in the Pacific Northwest. That is one form of advocacy, I can tell you right now. That is all unlimited as a bit, or as form and function of our tax status. So that's something that you should know about as well. So much of what you do isn't lobbying activity, falls outside of the definitions of lobbying. It is formally accepted. There are exceptions to lobbying that we'll talk about in a moment here. Those are all unlimited types of activities, and you don't have to worry about crossing any lines there, really. The limitations that come about to our lobbying activity is going to be, and by the way, folks, I'm going to take questions all the way at the end. I appreciate all the questions coming in. Stack them up in the Q&A box if you can. That would be great. And we will answer them at the end. Just so you know, I don't want anybody hanging here waiting on me to answer a raised hand. Lobbying limitations come in two different ways, and the first way is it is because of tax. Federal tax law says that no substantial part of what you do can be lobbying activity. And that is one of the ways that you can measure it. The other way that you can measure it is something that's called the 501h election. I'm not going to go really, really in depth into that choice and every ramification of it, but I'm here to tell you in our limited time together, that is by far the best choice for just about any group that I've ever run into that does bicycle advocacy. It measures your lobbying just based on what you spend money on. So if you are a very volunteer-driven organization, most of the work that gets done by your group is done by volunteers, whether they're board members or volunteers within your community. This is the way to go, because if your lobbying costs zero, then it counts as zero against your lobbying cap. It is a much better way to go. Cleaner, easier to understand definitions, easier reporting to the IRS at the end of the year, much easier, trust me on that. Your Form 990 is 3 numbers if you make the 501h election. If you don't, you're talking about narrative paragraphs, and you got to figure out how to report the volunteer activities. It's a mess, and I strongly would urge folks to make the 501h election. We've got a whole bunch of materials on all of that as well. Most of you are organizations that have annual expenditures under $500,000, which means the thing that you've heard probably here and there that you can lobby up to 20% of your overall activity, that actually is applying to groups that are $500,000 or less. The percentage comes down the larger of a group you are, but the actual dollars do expand. That is your overall lobbying cap space. 1/4 of that can be used for grassroots lobbying efforts. And I'll get into the definitions of that in a moment. Total lobbying is direct lobbying, talking to legislators directly, or grassroots, and then grassroots lobbying is the other part. That is talking to the general public, trying to encourage them to contact legislators. Those two things together make up your overall lobbying limit. So a quick little bit of math. I became a lawyer to avoid math. $500,000 organization, your breakdown, if you wanted to max out on every element of lobbying that you could, look something like this. 20% of 500,000 means your total lobbying limit is $100,000. 1/4 of that can be used for grassroots lobbying, which means the rest can be used for direct lobbying. So if you maxed out as an organization of this type of budget, it would look something like this. You would be able to do $25,000 of grassroots lobbying, $75,000 of direct lobbying that maxes out both your grassroots limit and your total limit. Doesn't mean you have to do this. This is just what your limits look like if you max them all out. I'm here to tell you most groups don't do this. Most groups don't come anywhere near this. But when you look at this, you're thinking 1 out of every $5 can be spent on lobbying activity by a group of this size or smaller. That's a really permissive amount. And most organizations, like I said, don't come anywhere near this. Ultimately speaking, we are limited in how much lobbying we can accomplish, how much lobbying we can do, but we're allowed to do a fair amount of it, sometimes much more than we would really ever even want to, given our choice. So you hear a lot about limitations, but effectively, functionally, it may not be much of a limit to you. The one thing that ends up being more of a limit, especially to groups in this type of atmosphere, is that you end up taking a private foundation grant or a government grant. Government grants almost exclusively tell you that you cannot use their funds for lobbying activity. Private foundation grants, they don't have to, but sometimes they do. My organization has spent the better part of the last 30 years trying to convince private foundations not to put these restrictive clauses in there because it's not necessary for the reasons why they put them in there. Some funders will do that. Again, if it's a government related grant, it's almost always going to be part of law. It basically says you can't use that money for lobbying activity. It does not mean you can't lobby at all. You just have to use other funds, what we call non-restricted funds. So you're allowed to lobby, you just got to use other people's funds, individual donors, private foundation grants that don't have those restrictive clauses, any other form that doesn't have that restrictive clause. The interesting thing is that even if you've got a government grant or you've got a grant with a restrictive clause from a private foundation, you can use those grants typically for non-lobbying advocacy work, things that fall outside of the definition of lobbying, all those things in green bubbles that I had earlier. And that can be organizing, education, things like that, things that are still advocacy. They just don't count as lobbying activity. So what is it that you got to know? You got to know the definitions of lobbying, because knowing what the definition of lobbying is means you know what lobbying is not. So it helps you keep this type of a promise that I know so many of you have to deal with. So here are the definitions of lobbying. If you make the 501h election, if you haven't made the 501h election, again, I would really encourage you to do so. If you're still like, wait, what the heck is that? We can cover that up in Q&A, and there's also some resources that I'll make sure to give you as well so that you can figure that out. These definitions are much more bright line and easier to understand. They break down easily into elements, and I'm going to cover those elements one by one here. So first of all, communication. That's pretty easy. That's any way of getting your point of view across. It's a meeting, it's a DM, it's a text, it's a letter, it's a website, it's social media post, it's projecting a message on the side of a hotel in Washington, D.C., for instance. Any way of getting your point of view across. That's pretty easy. Legislators. So this is whom you are speaking to will determine whether it's direct lobbying or grassroots lobbying. For direct lobbying, we're talking to legislators. So it's federal, state, and local. So this is a federal law, federal tax law, but it reaches all the way down to lobbying, even at the most local level. So anybody that is a legislator in the federal, state, or local bodies, they count. Their staff also counts, because so if you're talking to a chief of staff or a legislative aide as a conduit to get to their boss, they are a legislator. Regional governments, tribal governments, they also count. I think I told you I did some work in the Pacific Northwest, specifically Portland, Oregon. We have regional government in Portland. That also counts, even though it's a separate form, separate layer of government in there. Who also counts as legislators? This will come up in our bicycle advocacy from time to time because of bond measures, or even state level measures will occasionally have some type of impact on what we do in the bicycling advocacy space. Ballot measures count. So the general public typically is in the grassroots lobbying category. We'll get to that in a moment. But when you got a ballot measure, what you have is a super legislative body. Could be just at the municipal level or the county level or the state level. But when you're talking to voters in that context, they are part of a gigantic legislative body voting yes or no on a particular piece of legislation that's before them. So in a quirky, weird exception, talking to the general public around ballot measures or ballot questions or whatever they call them in your locality, they are legislators for purposes of that. And that's very helpful for us as C3s. Ballot measures can be very expensive campaigns. And remember, a couple slides ago, I said that direct lobbying, we have more capacity to do it. So it's really good that ballot measures count as direct lobbying because the public is considered a legislative. They are considered legislators in that context. It's a good exception for us here. Who else counts? Well, if you're of a certain age like I am and you learned everything about government from Schoolhouse Rock, you will be shocked and stunned to know that Schoolhouse Rock left this piece out of that one episode. Sometimes executive branch folks are considered legislators, and that is when they are participating in the formulation of legislation. So governors, presidents, occasionally mayors, when they are submitting a budget to a legislative body, they are writing that legislation. They are participating in the formulation of it. So if you're talking to a president or a governor about submitting a budget, particular line items, for instance, that is legislation right there, and you are talking to a legislator. The context, the subject matter of what you're talking about to a member of the executive branch, and it's almost always going to be a very high level person, typically chief executive level, that makes them a legislator. Very narrow exception, very narrow situation. The vast majority of times you're talking to folks in the executive branch, you're not talking to a legislator, therefore you're not lobbying under these rules. And we'll dog-ear that for a moment here. You're not talking to a legislator for purposes of your limitations on lobbying under federal tax law. Another area where chief executives sometimes will become legislators, if you're talking to them about signing or vetoing a piece of legislation, they are a legislator for purposes of that conversation there. So very narrow, but very important thing to understand of how executive branch folks are sometimes considered legislators. Almost every other instance, they are not. You're not lobbying for purposes of tax law limits. Who else doesn't count as a legislator? Folks that are part of special purpose bodies, school boards, zoning boards, bicycle advisory boards like the one in Seattle. These are considered special purpose boards because they have a narrow area of authority. A bicycle advisory board is not going to pass civil rights legislation or a Clean Air Act. They don't have, I'll use the technical term, they don't have plenary authority like the Washington State Legislature. Congress has plenary authority over all of the United States. These special advisory boards do not. They're pinned in by topic. And under the law, nobody who serves on those types of boards or agencies count as legislators. So that's really helpful. That means that any advocacy before these folks never counts as lobbying for purposes of your limits. Really, really helpful thing for so much of what we do. Let's talk a little bit about the other area where it's going to tip as to whether something counts or does not count for lobbying activity, and that is whether something counts as specific legislation. I'll start with the easy stuff. The easy stuff is the easy stuff for a reason, right? You know, there's a bill, it's got the squiggly font at the top, it's got a title, it's got a number, it's been submitted. That all counts. That's the easy stuff. Draft legislation also counts. So before it's submitted, it's a draft kind of rolling around that maybe you're being asked for input on. That is specific legislation as well. The budget is always legislation. Even if you're only talking about one line of the budget, that is also legislation. Very important, because a lot of folks think, oh, if I'm only talking about one piece of the budget, it's not legislation. That is not true. Under the law, any element of a budget bill is considered as much a part of the overall bill in terms of legislation for purposes of these rules as talking about the whole bill itself. So that's important to know. Nominations that go through just one body for approval, for confirmation. Mayor Pete is now Secretary Pete because he went through the whole process for the Department of Transportation. Even though it was just the U.S. Senate voting on that, that also counts as legislation. So judges, cabinet officials, that all counts too. You want the cheat code? To be perfectly honest, the cheat code is this: if there's a vote in a legislative body, it counts as legislation. That's your cheat code right there. I just put myself out of business. The things that it goes a little bit further than that, and I like to illustrate it this way: anything that's considered a specific policy proposal, that counts as legislation. And that, as so many things that with the IRS and tax law, is not left very defined. So let me just kind of yada yada it a bit for you here. If you identify a problem and then at the same time identify a solution to that problem that can only be accomplished through the passage of a new law, that is a specific policy proposal, and you can come up with it off the cuff. So if you were talking to a legislator and just shooting the breeze about bicycles, and then the legislator asks, hey, do you think we should spend more money on bicycle trails? And you said, yeah, we should absolutely do that. That right there is lobbying, believe it or not. You're communicating to a legislator and you've just offered a specific policy proposal. You cannot spend more money in government without passing a new budget bill. So that would have been a specific policy proposal. I don't do that to freak you out or scare you or anything. I just want to let you see where the ultimate limits are. This rarely comes up, but it's something to think about when you are pulling together your advocacy plans. And this is kind of the ultimate expression of when it starts counting. And that, by the way, is something that I get a lot in terms of a question. When does the clock start ticking when we're working on policy work? Well, once you make the call internally as an organization that you're going to be doing lobbying work, from that point on, you need to start tracking your time. Most of the lobbying costs that we incur as organizations are paid staff time working on lobbying. That's where it mostly comes. Sure, there may be travel costs or some other things, but that's usually much less important than the actual hours that are spent by a staff person working on that policy work that happens to count as lobbying. If you're still mulling over whether or not you're going to be working on a piece of legislation or you're going to be lobbying, you don't need to count that time. But once you decide internally that you're going to be working on something, start tracking the meetings. Prep work counts. The work drafting things counts. That's all this kind of stuff that ends up going into your reports that eventually go to the IRS at the end of, well, usually the following year. For those of you who don't know much about your Form 990, first of all, congratulations. Someone else is doing it for your organization. But if you do, you know darn well that generally speaking, you're not going to be reporting any lobbying to the IRS until the following May. So that's why it's really good and important for you to keep good records in the time that you're doing it, because you're not going to remember all of these things the following May when the report is due, the Form 990 is due to the IRS. Generally speaking, when it comes to this particular rule, I've heard of a bunch of folks come to me and say, hey, well, what if I say that I decided to lobby right before my meeting with the member of Congress or with the member of the state legislature? This is where I say, don't get cute about this kind of stuff. You know, if you do have folks who are coming after your organization and they're trying to trigger an IRS audit. First of all, audits are really, really rare. The IRS is terrible at enforcing this kind of stuff. But if they did manage to get that happen, the IRS would see right through that. Don't be cute about how you approach your reporting around these things. It's really easy to kind of suss out and sniff out. What about the real world? Let's talk more about the real world. Very rarely do we take meetings or do things that are just a single track, right? We do things that are mixed purpose. And in this context, sometimes we do things that we attend a meeting or we have a press conference or something along those lines where what we're doing is a mixture of lobbying and non-lobbying activity. What's the best way to handle all of that when we're trying to track our time and track our, for purposes of our reporting? Well, Here's my best practices tip for you. You're not going to find this in any particular law. This is kind of an interpretation of a variety of ways that the IRS looks at mixed purpose activities across other areas. My tip here is if more than half of your overall meeting or activity or communication is lobbying activity, count the whole thing. It's just easier that way, since the majority of it, the primary purpose of that activity is lobbying. It's easier just to count the whole thing rather than to slice that tomato real thin. If it's less than half, though, if it's only a small part, if you're having a meeting with a legislator about the current state of cycling within your community, for instance, and at the very end, you end up having a discussion that's maybe a few minutes long about a piece of legislation that's before that legislator. In that instance, it makes a lot more sense to track it proportionately, because you don't want to have to count the whole thing just for a couple of minutes worth of the meeting. So less than half, if it's a secondary purpose, as we like to say in tax law, then track and report it proportionally. But if it's the primary purpose of the whole meeting, count the whole thing. It's just easier for you to deal with all of that. So I talked a lot about what counts as legislation. Here's the stuff that doesn't. And by the way, a large swath of advocacy that we do as bicycle advocates happens in this area that's not specific legislation, regulatory work, things that come about as a result of executive orders, asking for changes in the enforcement of existing laws, and then litigation. In all of these instances, the law has been passed. It's already been passed, and it's the dealing with that law in its past form, past PASSED form, and it's a promulgated form, that is, typically speaking, not lobbying. Let me back up. It is not lobbying for IRS purposes. I am going to dog ear this once again. Remember, I said I've been dog earing a few things around lobbying. IRS rules say this is not lobbying activity. Your state, and sometimes your local municipalities may say something a little bit different. Not that it would limit how much you can do. Only the IRS can limit how much lobbying you can do, but you may have reporting requirements around regulatory or executive order type of work that applies at the state level. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But for purposes of the IRS and your tax exempt status, the limitations that it imposes on you as a C3, none of this counts. So regulatory work, anytime an ordinance or a law has been passed and now it's coming to the Department of Transportation, typically, that is going to be making the specific rules on how to enforce that law, about how vehicles are supposed to behave around bicycle lanes, things along those lines. Your advocacy in that space does not count against your IRS lobbying limits. Very important. You can do as much of that as you'd like. Any of the work that you do for local, state, or federal departments of transportation does not count against your lobbying limits. Very important. Executive orders. Used to have a hard time finding examples of executive orders, but I have this great one here from about creation of a bicycle advocacy commission in Philadelphia. All of those stay-at-home orders from COVID, those were executive orders. Chief executive usually making some kind of a promulgation within the authority that they have, or the powers that they have around law enforcement typically, and also promulgation of rules here in Philadelphia in particular. Asking for changes in how law enforcement handles bicycle travel within your community. A lot of different communities are asking law enforcement to change how they handle bicyclists and stop signs, for instance, where that's a potential thing. That's one of the areas that you can act in as an advocate. It does not count against your lobbying cap. And then finally, litigation. Many of you don't engage in litigation as a tool, but if you do litigation, your cause of action is actually something that has already been passed. I told you before, I used to sue polluters under the Clean Water Act. That was passed when I was precisely 1 year old. It's not lobbying to litigate under the Clean Water Act or in any other way that is helpful for your advocacy work. So let's go back to the definitions of lobbying. Grassroots lobbying includes one other extra element, and that is the call to action. So when you're communicating to the general public, you're letting them know about the specific legislation, then you got to deal with the call to action. It's not grassroots lobbying unless you include one of these four things. It is essentially saying, Hey, general public, we just got done telling you how we feel about this legislation. Now go contact your legislators. That's the call to action. And I know calls to action, by the way, if you're in organizing or if you've been working in other spaces, it has different definitions. So one of only 4 things in this space. It's explicitly saying, hey, everybody, go contact your legislator, go contact your senator, the mayor, your member of your city council. That counts as a call to action. Providing an address, a telephone number, or some other way of getting in contact. Click here to contact also is providing a mechanism. Used to be back in the day when I first got started, it was, tear off this little thing from the sign that I put on the telephone pole with a phone number to contact the legislators. Well, we've gotten a little more sophisticated since then, where you can click on something and it generates an email for you. Same thing. It's a call to action. It's providing a mechanism. Finally, identifying folks that are opposed to your point of view or undecided relative to your point of view. That also counts as a call to action. It's called an indirect call to action. It's not a super effective way of doing it, but I raise it here because you are allowed to use that in one of the exceptions. You can't use any of the other 3, but you can use this last one, this indirect one, in a place that I'm going to highlight in a couple minutes for you. So I keep dog-earing things for you, but hopefully you're following along, right? Examples of calls to action here. Here's one from Washington Area Bicycling Association. Call your council members today. Boom, call to action. Call and email your council members today. We have 2 calls to action in here. Does that mean it double counts as lobbying? No, absolutely not. You can have as many calls to action in there as you want. If you have one and it's a communication to the general public about specific legislation, well, then it ends up counting as lobbying. So if you're going to do grassroots lobbying, put in as many calls to action as you'd like. Here's another example here. This is a more recent one. Bicycling still under attack in Arizona. Your state representatives need to hear from you again. Call to action. Then we've got this compose the message section where the person fills it out. You basically make it easier for them to contact their member of the Arizona legislature. The little red button that says send, that's a mechanism. These are also calls to action here. What happens if you don't have one of those types of things in your public communication that supports or opposes legislation? Well, as you can probably figure out, it's not lobbying activity. Is it good advocacy? Yeah, it's your organization taking a stance and publicly mentioning, saying, "Hey, we oppose this bill in the state of Arizona. It's a terrible idea. Just thought you'd all want to know. Learn more. Support our efforts." Anything that is not one of those 4 calls to actions, the whole thing doesn't count as lobbying activity. So sometimes that can be helpful for those of you who have restricted funds that we talked about earlier. If you don't have a call to action in with these types of communications, it's not going to be considered grassroots lobbying. It's a way around that. It may also be a situation where maybe you've maxed out on your lobbying cap space and you still want to take a stance on maybe something that's a secondary priority for you, but you don't have grassroots lobbying capacity left. Another option for you right here. Let's take a look at an example here. And this is, whoops, there we go. This is out of the Bicycle Alliance in Minnesota. It was advocacy through a tweet, and there was a budget line item to turn a traffic lane into a cycling greenway. So let's go through the same thing that I would do if somebody asked me if this is lobbying. Run through the elements. Is it a communication? Well, yes, it's a way of getting your point of view across, no problem. Is it about specific legislation? Yes, because it's about a budget line in there. Who's the audience? It's to the general public. We're on Twitter. Easy way around this, by the way, any online communication that is not a direct message is almost always going to be considered a general public communication. So we're in grassroots lobbying analysis here. Do we have a call to action in here? Council members have expressed hesitancy to sign off without public input, and then link to an article. There's no call to action there. It's just saying council members is not specific enough to identify anyone. Plus, it's identifying the entire council. So there's no call to action here whatsoever. This would not be considered grassroots lobbying at all. So good example there. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions because I see that they are stacked up like cordwood in the Q&A. So I'm excited to tackle those. I want to do lobbying exceptions and make sure I get to resources for you here too in the next about 4 minutes or so. Give us about 15 minutes for Q&A just to give you guys a heads up. Lobbying exceptions, there are 4 of them. I'm going to highlight 2 of them. The rest of them you can read more about in the publication that I'm going to be sharing with you in a little bit that you can download for free. The first one that's super, super important, nonpartisan analysis, study, or research. IRS gives these really long names to these exceptions. These are basically a research report that is presented broadly to the general public. They're usually typically written, but there's nothing in the law that says that this can't be a documentary series on YouTube or a podcast. What it does have to do is when you put out this information, you can come out with a point of view, a policy point of view, a conclusion. But what you also have to do is, if there are other points of view on the same topic, you at least have to raise them. But that does not mean that you have to raise them neutrally or that you have to champion other people's ideas that you don't agree with. You can raise them and then you can knock them down. The idea here is that you're at least letting the reader understand that there are other options around you and that you reach a conclusion that's different from the other folks because of your nonpartisan analysis, study, and research, right? So the content is like that. Can't be a fact sheet. It's got to be a little more in depth than that. So that's why these tend to be thicker reports with real data in them or something along those lines. Or like I said, could be a documentary or something along those lines. Once you got the content down, the rest is easy. Get it out there, broadly disseminate it. Put it on on your website, put it on YouTube, put it everywhere. Print out copies, give them to everyone that are part of your allies. Give them to every legislator that is voting on the type of policy that you're trying to propose as well. They're part of the general public too. If you do this, you are within firmly a lobbying exception. Everything that you've done, and these can be expensive. They can be time consuming. Time equals money for paid staff. These are formally accepted as lobbying under the IRS rules. This is really helpful because, like I said, this would otherwise count against your lobbying cap. This does not if you do it in this way. But here's the other cool thing. When you broadly release these reports, your allies in the community are also going to get them. And maybe they're going to approach legislators and do lobbying on their own using your report. Well, that was your report, not theirs. Your money spent, not theirs. So you've just made their lobbying more effective and cheaper. Real synergistic effects that happen here too. In addition to the fact that you're giving them to a bunch of legislators too that might be voting on a piece of legislation that you could actually formally propose in this very document. You can do that too. You're also even allowed to have that 4th call to action in there, just identifying folks who are opposed or undecided relative to your point of view. That can go in there, but no other call to action. You put another call to action into this, one of those other 3, you've blown it. This thing is a grassroots lobbying communication at that point. So don't do any of that. Do all the stuff that I've mentioned, and you are accepted from lobbying. The other thing that I think is really helpful for many of you is if you get invited to testify on behalf either for or against a piece of legislation, if that invite comes in writing from the chair of the committee, and it's got to be this way for this exception to hit, in writing from the chair of the committee, then all of the staff time, all of the prep time, travel costs, if you've got them, none of that ends up counting under the technical assistance exception to lobbying. But key point, it's got to be in writing. It's got to come from the chair of the committee. Now, you may end up getting invited by somebody else. And if it's an important bill and you can't get that invite from the chair, still go and lobby. If it's an important piece of legislation, I just want to make sure that you understand that this is available to you if you want to reduce the impact on your cap. If this is available to you, you can solicit these invitations. So if you've been invited by somebody else on the committee, you can ask the chair of the committee for a written invitation, see if that works. It often does. But solicitation is possible for this. Technical assistance are real happy exception for many of you. This is where all the dog ears that I told you to do, this is where I'm going to undo the dog ear. I mentioned this sort of in passing, but everything that I've been talking about so far, federal tax law, the definitions count towards our limitations on how much lobbying we can do. You may be in a state or in a municipality that has an additional lobbying disclosure act, and they will say, look, we can't limit how much lobbying you can do. That's all for tax law. But we're going to ask that if you lobby are folks that you register and report. And oh, by the way, we're going to have sometimes different definitions as to what lobbying is. We don't care what the IRS lobbying definitions are. If you come, for instance, in the state of California, for instance, if you come and lobby our executive branch agencies, we know the IRS doesn't count that. You can do as much of that as you want. But here in California, you're going to register and report if you hit a certain threshold. That is pretty common in a lot of states. Local municipalities will sometimes have those types of rules too, where the lobbying definitions differ than the IRS. We've got resources on the state level for over 30 states to help you out. You can check that out on our website, boulderadvocacy.org, to see where that differentiation is and to see how you're going to have to make sure that your systems fit for these distinctions. Again, the states, the localities, they can never limit how much you can do around lobbying, but they can make you register and report in places where the IRS wouldn't count it. Just a little bit of an extra layer for you to understand there. Resources before we go to Q&A. The two best publications that we have on this topic are both free. You can get them from our website. It's called Being a Player. It's got all of the definitions. You can read it at a much slower pace than I talk, which I recognize is fast, but I have to cover a lot of stuff in an hour. The other thing, I didn't get much into this, but record keeping. You are asked by the IRS to keep records of things. Now, the good news is they don't have any formal systems for that. So it's kind of a paradox of choice. You want to pick the easiest system to fit your needs. Our publication, Keeping Track, can help you with that. If you're looking at maybe zhuzhing up your particular record keeping system, I would have you take a look at that. If you are not tired of hearing me podcast, I am on our podcast, The Rules of the Game, which talks about these rules. We do this every couple of weeks. We talk about lobbying rules. We talk about election rules. If you're thinking about forming a 501c4 to do more advocacy work, we talk about that as well. You can check that out anywhere you get your podcasts or at our website. And last but not least, I promise this. If we cannot get to everybody's question today, please feel free to reach out anytime you want. Advocacy@afj.org or that number 866-675-6229. If you call that and leave a voicemail or send an email, it's either going to be myself or one of my attorney colleagues. We cannot be your lawyers. We're not set up for that, but we can give you technical assistance on anything having to do with your tax-exempt organization and advocacy. So lobbying rules, anything along those lines, stuff I talked about today, stuff I'm going to be talking about in, later around election-related activity. Absolutely ask us any questions. I'm going to leave this up while I pull up the Q&A box, and I'm going to answer these in the order that they came. So I see 25. Which may be daunting for me to get through before the top of the hour. I can stick around for a few extra minutes if that is physically possible within our system here. So I will try to do all of this.
Yeah. Hey,
Dave,
Tim.
Oh yeah,
I've been monitoring the box, so I think we can go through a couple of them pretty quickly.
You fire away.
Okay.
Curate away.
So one question is, can you share the slides?
Absolutely. I will make sure that you'll get them and that it can be disseminated out to all of the folks who registered. Absolutely, 100%.
Great. That's about 5 of them. A couple questions about what expenses organizations have to report as lobbying. If they have a contract lobbyist, do they have to report those expenses?
Yes. So anytime that you're spending money on lobbying, including if you pay somebody else to do the lobbying, that counts as an expenditure in furtherance of lobbying. So if you're paying a lobbyist to do your work, great, that's awesome. You got a pro that's doing that work, but whatever you're spending on that lobbyist is what ends up counting against your lobbying cap space, assuming what they're doing is actually lobbying under these definitions. Very often we'll hire contractors, we'll hire lobbyists, and sometimes they'll do work that actually is not lobbying activity. So if that's the case, if they're doing work before a regulatory agency, for instance, that's not going to count against your lobbying cap space for purposes of the federal rules. Now, if you're in a state where that has to be, you have to register and report, you may have to kind of divvy up the system a little bit there. But yes, anytime you pay a lobbyist to do lobbying things under these definitions, that's what you end up reporting.
What about if you have a marketing staff or a communications staff that is editing or sending calls to action?
So if they are working on grassroots lobbying, then typically your system will want to track their time through some kind of a time tracking or a timesheet system. For instance, my organization, if I was ever to do anything that was lobbying activity, we have a cost center that I actually have to track my time. So if I worked for an hour on that day on that particular thing, if I was reviewing, well, I'll give you a great example. We often will do some work around Supreme Court nominations. The other side of the office does that kind of work. If I review any kind of grassroots lobbying communication from a legal perspective for 1 hour, then I would track that for the hour. The graphics design folks, the marketing folks, if they work on that communication for an hour and it's grassroots lobbying, that gets put into that timesheet system. Different systems for different organizations. Some folks have really sophisticated online time trackers. Some folks have essentially what we call lobbying reporting forms, which is basically a half a sheet of paper where they scribble out the information and it gets thrown in a box for some lucky person to throw into a spreadsheet down the line. Your organizations have your own systems. If you don't have one, I'd recommend you take a look at our publication, Keeping Track. It goes from the most sophisticated systems down to the simplest systems, and you can figure out which one makes the most sense for you.
What about all volunteer organizations?
These are the groups, I just talked to an almost entirely volunteer organization the other day, and the answer to that is I really recommend for you to make the 501H elections. Tell the IRS with a half-page form 5768, hey, we want to use the system where we have to spend money for our lobbying to count. Because when you're with an all-volunteer organization, that means you're spending $0 on anything. It's all volunteer work. Your board members, your community folks coming in. If you could be doing everything, could be lobbying. Your organization's advocacy can be 100% fitting within these definitions of lobbying. But if it's all volunteers, you're spending $0. So if you make the 501H election, you end up reporting 0 every single year. If you don't do that and you're a volunteer organization, volunteer hours do count as lobbying, and you actually could run afoul. You could lose your tax status. And I don't mean to scare you here. You could conceivably lose your tax status by doing all volunteer lobbying efforts and doing too much of it. By the way, under the other system, the non-501H system, it's not real clear what no substantial part means. We think it's somewhere between 3 and 5%, but it is not a bright line. There is no chart like I showed you earlier for the 501H limits. So this is why for volunteer organizations, or all volunteer organizations, I really truly underscore how important it is that you make the 501H election, because it can really be protective of you if you do end up doing a fair amount of lobbying, more than what no substantial part is.
Okay, we have a few organizations that are under a $50,000 budget, so they do a 990N or a 990E, the postcard.
Yeah, I happen to be on a board of another one, the Pigs and Pugs Project. Look it up. We don't do anything around bicycles, just around pigs and pugs. So your lobbying doesn't get reported on a 990N. I would still recommend for those organizations to make the 501H election. It only because what if someday you do grow to be larger than that and you're now filling out a form 990EZ? Well, on the 990EZs, you do end up reporting that activity. And I just think that it's a cleaner, easier space. You still technically need to comply with all of the lobbying rules, even though your 990 doesn't contain that filing information. I would still recommend, even for the truly small organizations, to make the 501H election.
Okay, and then how do you decide who has to register as a lobbyist?
That's going to depend on state law. Typically, there is a federal lobbying disclosure act, but for the most part, those thresholds are so high that you really kind of know it when you are doing enough federal lobbying work that you'll have to comply with those. But at the state level, depending on the state that you're in, those thresholds can be humorously low, to be honest. I think Missouri's was like $50 or something comically low. Illinois just changed their rules recently, very low threshold, $500. That's it. I mean, we're only talking a few staff hours before someone might have to register and report. It's going to be very, very state specific or locally specific, because there are some municipalities that have those rules as well. I recommend that you take a look at our series. We have a state guidance series that's available on our website. I believe we've got over 30 states covered at this point. So you can check it out. They're written in a very easy way to understand where those thresholds and those reporting requirements are. Sometimes the organization registers, sometimes the individual does, sometimes both. So you're going to need to know that for your state. So I would definitely recommend that you, and by the way, sometimes it's a little bit quicker if you just go Google Boulder Advocacy, your state's name and lobbying, and then it'll pop up if we've got it for you.
Okay.
Not to denigrate our website, but
So another question, let's say an organization has an e-newsletter and it has 6 stories and one of them is a call to action. How do you track resources that you have to charge to lobbying?
Yeah, good question there. That goes back to the mixed purpose slide that I had. So in that instance, you've got a newsletter that's going out. 1/6 of it is lobbying activity, right? So that's much less than half. I would say it's perfectly appropriate to proportionately report and track it. So if it's a newsletter, that means that staff time went into it. So it's just the time that went into the prep and the writing of that lobbying article itself. As far as the distro of it, e-newsletters are kind of trickier than a traditional, print newsletter. With print newsletters back in the day, it was like, oh, well, we had print costs, so it would only be 1/6 of that print cost. Here, you may be working with, I don't know, MailChimp or Constant Contact or something like that. You've got a monthly charge. You would divvy it up. So like let's say if the entire month, it's like that, you've got a little policy corner, and every month it's 1/6 of your newsletter. I think that it's fair at that point to count 1/6 of the monthly e-newsletter costs for MailChimp or Constant Contact or whatever you're using. Count that as part of your grassroots lobbying, or count that as a grassroots lobbying expense. You just tally it up. All of these things, they're small expenses that you tally up throughout the year. And I would definitely, again, urge you, especially if you're working under the 501H rules, that you want to be tallying these up in real time, because at the end of the year, you've got them all there. They're hopefully living in a spreadsheet someplace, and then it's super easy just to add that all up. When you make the 501H election, you're only reporting 3 numbers: grassroots lobbying, direct lobbying, and then the third one is you add them up. That's what you do. So if you do the work a little bit at a time through the year, it makes your May 1st, when you realize in 2 weeks that your 990 is due, that much easier.
A couple questions about who could qualify as a legislator.
Sure.
So if you have a city manager.
Yeah. The municipal level, it's often a little weird, because that's when lines tend to blur between executive branch functionality and legislative branch functionality. Typically speaking, and if you're in Portland, Oregon, you know very well you're about to get a city manager for the first time in 100-odd years. That's going to be an executive branch agency person in that circumstance, because they are running executive branch agencies below them. Typically, that's going to be the case. There are some municipalities where you may have a legislator, a member of the city council, for instance, that will also have that functionality too. They carry both roles. And if that's the case, it's going to be the subject matter of what you're talking to them about that's going to determine which hat they're wearing. If you're talking to them, hey, you should vote this way on this ordinance that's before you. Well, in that instance, you're talking to a legislator. But if you're talking to them about their implementation of rules for the police bureau, then you're talking to probably an executive branch person about non-legislative stuff. So you're not lobbying in that instance. So at the local level, it's very much what are you talking to them about and what are their roles that will sometimes determine whether they're a legislator.
Okay. So if they're choosing between policy A and policy B, but there's no vote, is that lobbying?
Depends on what's the thing that's effectuating policy A versus policy B. If it's a law has already been passed, and this is an executive agency decision that's trying to decide how to promulgate that law, and they have a couple of different choices or multiple choices. Well, that's an executive branch decision. That's not going to be considered lobbying under the IRS rules. Again, caveat, if you're in a state where that would be considered part of the state lobbying rules, you may have to register and report for that kind of stuff. But under the IRS rules, that would not count.
Okay, and I had a similar question about planning commissioners who may be elected.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. That fits into the special purpose body. A planning commission typically, it can be very, very powerful, and in many municipalities elected. But because they don't have plenary authority within the borders that they control, they can only do things around planning or sometimes zoning or things along those lines. They actually are not considered legislators, even though they are elected officials. I know in Oregon, for instance, we had water agencies that were I've got the wrong terminology because I've been away from Oregon too long, but they were incredibly powerful, particularly east of the Cascades, where water is a really important resource. But they aren't considered legislators either, just like the planning commissioners that you're talking about here. May be very powerful, may have a ton of impact, but they fit outside of the definitions of a legislator, can advocate before them as much as you'd like. It doesn't count against your lobbying cap. Check your state rules to see whether or not you have to register and report for that type of activity, but you're never limited in how much you can do.
Okay. Is there any concern with having a board member who sits on an advisory council?
No, that's typically going to, that happens quite a bit, quite frankly. In fact, I've had on C3s that I've been involved in, I had a member of Congress on my very first one. So, you can't have elected officials, you can't have folks that kind of have different roles. Now, when they're a board member for your organization, they owe a duty to your organization, a variety of different duties that are a function of state law, state corporate law, actually, believe it or not. So they do have to, they have to do things in a particular way on behalf of your organization versus when they also have rules outside of it, but that's typically going to be okay. There may be ethics rules for the other roles that they have, if they have some kind of a government official role in some way, shape, or form, but that's not going to be on the nonprofit side. That's going to be on the other side of things very typically.
So for executive branch rulemaking, is that considered lobbying or is that regulation?
So executive branch rulemaking, any kind of notice and comment rulemaking, any of that kind of stuff, the IRS never counts that as lobbying. That is outside of the definitions. However, in your state where you're at, that may be something that you have to register and report for, but you'll never be limited in how much you can do. And that's where things can get sometimes a little complex for a smaller C3, right? We have to worry about these the definitions that I just spent the better part of the hour talking about, because you got to deal with that for the IRS. And then you got to deal with another set of definitions that may differ slightly within your state, and you have different responsibilities for them. But the cheat sheet on that is the federal ones that I covered. Those are the ones that have to do with the limitations on how much you can do. Regulatory work is the kind that would fit in maybe your state, and they will never limit how much you can do, but they might impact whether you have to register and report with the state for that activity. And that's, again, all going to be dependent on your state and the rules within your state.
Okay. If an organization has a call to action to support or oppose a specific piece of infrastructure, would that be considered lobbying? It's not legislation, but it could be part of a city or a district's budget.
Yeah, I think that's really going to depend. So let's say that there is a crumbling bit of bicycle infrastructure that you really want to make sure gets fixed. And so you're advocating, you're saying, hey, everybody protect this bike infrastructure. And that piece of bike infrastructure is part of the city or the state's budget that year. I think at that point, what I would say is that you're identifying that infrastructure enough in the context of it also being part of the budget, that it may as well be the same thing, that you're basically advocating for the passage of that budget. If it's a little more attenuated than that, maybe you could say that it's non-lobbying, but I think that just this one particular hypothetical here, I would say that that's close enough that you're identifying a particular line item within a budget well enough that the public would get that, and that you're essentially saying, hey, general public, support this line item in the budget. Go contact your legislator. That counts as grassroots lobbying.
Okay. And then what if an organization takes an elected official on a tour? And that could be either to support something that's coming, or the specific question is about something that's already passed, that's already been funded.
So it's really typical that us in the tax exempt community, we've got, we want to take elected officials on tours of places in their communities that are important, that need their attention, things like that. Super great thing for you to do. Very much a public charity function, totally fine. No problems at all. If you are doing that in the context where you're communicating to them saying, hey, we're going to take you on this tour of this crumbling bicycle infrastructure to show how much we need you to support this particular line item in the budget, you're directly lobbying them at that point, because you're communicating with them about that, essentially about that particular piece of legislation. If you were doing this more generally, you're saying, hey, we just want to take you on a little bike tour of the District of Columbia, just so that you see, hey, this is why we support bike lanes and bike infrastructure in DC, and why the last 10 years has been such a great thing, and how much it's improved transportation in the district. Just talking about things generally, that's not going to be considered lobbying. And I know that's a huge functionality for so many of the groups that are here today.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we can do a time check. For some folks here, they're both work as an advocate and then they volunteer as an advocate, or lobbying in both roles.
Yeah.
Is there anything specific they need to do about that, or do they just report their lobbying that they're doing as paid staff?
Yeah, I would say it depends on the system that your organization has, but typically speaking, if you're paid a salary, salaried people generally are considered to be paid all the time for the work that they're doing. So you would need to report the time that you spent lobbying on behalf of the organization if you are paid for it within the system that you've got. So whether it's a timesheet or whatever. I do a ton of stuff. My day job is this basically, right? But I will typically write letters in support of bicycle infrastructure on my own time in DC and elsewhere, right? So I'm doing that separate from my job. I am not being paid by Alliance for Justice for my bicycle advocacy. It happens to be very different, but that does not count against AFJ's lobbying capacity, because it is very much on my own time, not being compensated by any C3 for it. It's just me doing it. So that doesn't get recorded anyplace. The thing that gets a little tricky is when you've got somebody who's paid for some of the advocacy that they're doing by an organization, and then they take off that organization's hat and they put on their personal hat and go off and testify on their own behalf or write a letter on their own behalf. If it is truly on your own and it is not representing the organization and you are not compensated by the organization, does not count against the organization. But sometimes those lines blur a little bit depending on what's going on. So that's a good scenario that the facts really matter. And if somebody's got that scenario, I'd recommend that's a good opportunity to give us a call or shoot us an email, and we can kind of help walk you through how that would look or feel.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Those are most of the general questions.
Right.
We do have folks who have very specific questions that we can encourage to get in touch.
Absolutely. Yeah. advocacy@afj.org. Please feel free to email. That's probably the preferred way to do it, because you can give a little bit of a context of your question. And then we usually try to get back within 24 to 48 hours and go from there. And all my colleagues are super smart, smarter than me. way smarter than me. So maybe you'll draw a long straw and get someone else.
Okay. So I again want to say thank you for your time and thank you for being flexible with my technical difficulties. I want to say thank you to Safe Routes Partnership for helping to sponsor this webinar. And we'll get the slides and the resources, and I'll send them all out to folks who registered. I'll also send the correct link to register for the April webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all. Take care.